Hi, and welcome to the Women's Handbook podcast, How to Be a Woman, where we talk about everything women's health from menarche to matriarchy. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Hutchins, and today we are talking to not one, but two wonderful dietitians, Vanessa Amenorrhea and Carleen Duvenage, all about how to feed your teen. Now, as parents, we are bombarded by information on how to eat. You mustn't eat this, you've got to eat this, and it seems to change all the time. And knowing how to apply that to ourselves is a huge task, let alone working out which bits apply to our teens. But it is so important. Evidence shows that getting your teens' nutrition right can impact everything from their mental well-being to their academics to their risk of chronic disease in later life, even to when they get their first period. And the mental load for all of this, the shopping, the cooking, the worry over whether or not you're getting it right, does still tend to be a burden that falls to women. So I thought this would be a great episode for the podcast. So let's get started. Hi, ladies.
Hi.
How are you?
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me today. So pleased to have you. It's such a great topic for the podcast. So would you mind, I obviously know who you are, but would you mind just telling our listeners a little bit about you?
Sure. I'm Vanessa. I am a dietitian. I've been living in Singapore for 15 years now, and I have a private practice called the Traveling Dietitian. So I do see children and adults, but I do love seeing children and families and helping families just learn to love food and help them to make food a really important part of their family connection time.
Absolutely, so important. And you, Carleen, I know that you've got a special interest in neurodivergence and other things, so tell us about that.
Yes, so I'm Carleen. I'm been in Singapore for about 3 years. I'm originally from South Africa, and I think I've always had a special interest in sort of complex feeding challenges and just sort of when feeding and eating is hard. So I see mainly children and teens, and so many of my clients are neurodivergent. They also have potentially chronic diseases, especially gastrointestinal problems, and disabilities and then eating disorders. So I think, that summarizes a lot of my interest. And then obviously I work quite hard to understand these conditions quite well.
Yeah, amazing. And you've both got an interest in eating disorders, haven't you? So I know that you're both co-chairs for the Eating Disorder Interest Group for the Singapore Dietetics Association. Is that right?
Yes.
So what's your role in that? What do you do?
Well, we hold meetings with other dietitians and nutritionists, basically to advocate and educate the other dietitians and nutritionists in Singapore.
Right.
I think for us, it is not only to help the dietitians working with eating disorders to, for support and just also learning more, but also really for those dietitians that aren't necessarily working directly with eating disorders, but to help them just learn a bit more about early identification, prevention, knowing sort of the questions to ask.
Amazing. So like a training role.
Yeah, and picking up sort of red flags and stuff. And then also just networking. It can be quite isolating in private practice and lonely. So it's quite nice to get together and have that community.
Okay, great. So I definitely want to go into eating disorders a bit later. But just starting off a bit more generally, I think there is so much nutrition information out there, isn't there? I mean, just so much, particularly for adults, but also particularly for young children. So, the breastfeeding, the weaning advice, the toddler advice. But I do find it kind of falls away for the teens. So tell us about that. What do you think parents need to know about nutrition at this stage?
Yeah, I think even that falls away, even in the tween years, like 8+, it just sort of disappears. But I think mainly that it is obviously, as you said, a time where growth is really intense, not just physically, but emotionally, cognitively, socially. And that obviously means an increase in nutrient requirements. Nutrition becomes very important. It's probably the biggest time of growth and nutrition requirements, second only to that first year of life. And so it becomes really important, and not just for now, but also in the future. The other thing is that it comes with changes in the body, and not just shape change, but also weight gain, and that can be quite scary for some parents. But we do know that teens need to pick up weight. It's a sign of health. But yeah, I think it is the balance of managing this increased nutrient requirements with this autonomy and independence that's coming. Especially in Singapore, a lot of the teens are out and about. They're independent. They only get home like after 7, 8. And so a lot of their nutrition choices are being made outside of the home.
Yeah.
And so it's balancing all of that. It's tricky, but it is tricky. It's important.
Yeah, lots of competing things to think about. As parents, where do you see us getting it wrong? So one of the things I think I see is that parents will take the nutrition advice that they're seeing for adults, avoiding sugar, metabolic health, that type of thing, potentially even avoided food groups, and try to apply that to teens. Is that something you see?
Yes. Look, to start off, I think parents are quite, everyone is definitely trying their best.
Absolutely.
And, there's a lot of pressure on us to sort of get it right. We have this pressure that a child should look and eat in a certain way, and that reflects on us. Mm-hmm. So it's quite hard. But I think what happens is if that pressure filters down into the family, into the kids, it can actually be quite harmful. Mm-hmm. And so what I do see is sort of the over restriction or the overly controlling parent that wants to control everything that the child eats, getting quite fearful of certain foods and ingredients and food groups, and often not trying to perhaps restrict it, but not always so successful. And so what happens is a lot of shaming and guilt in our language. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of children that feel that, and this is from the teens that I work with, that their parents are nagging and constantly shaming their food choices and what they do. And so when a child is actually at a time where they need to eat bigger quantities than they were used to, their appetite changes, hormonal shifts and stuff, they're also influenced a lot by their peers and food choices. If you get that negative messaging and moralistic language around food, it can be quite harmful for a teen that is still sort of developing their identity with food. But equally, I also see almost the pendulum swing the other way, where parents have completely hands off, where there's no structure, no boundaries, no sort of support with the teens. They're not yet adults. They do still need support and structure and boundaries around food. And so that can sometimes also be a problem. Or what I sometimes see where children are experimenting with fad diets, starting to calorie count. And a lot of parents will then just see that as, oh, that's just normal teen behavior, and miss that sort of risky disordered eating symptoms and signs that come up. So it's sort of that Goldilocks problem of just, getting it just right in the middle.
Balance, right. Yeah. And it is really difficult because, as you said, there's so much pressure on parents, on mothers to get it right. And if your child is a bit overweight, or if they're seen to be eating unhealthy foods, that is very shaming as a parent. So, and also we do know of the benefits of getting the nutrition right at this stage of life. So it's very, very difficult to then see a child perhaps eating in a way that you feel is unhealthy, but be able to approach that with that child in a way that is healthy. I think I find it very difficult, and I'm sure most parents do. What advice do you have for parents on how to approach that? Because, as you said, we don't want to be completely hands off. They do need guiding. But often when you are trying to advocate for healthier choices, it does come across as nagging.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
So it can look very different between families, and the families that I support with this, like sometimes I look at the advice that I give and it can be very different. Mm-hmm. But I think it helps to first look at perhaps the language that you use around food, to try and take out the morality out of food, labeling it as good or bad, and talking about food, naming it for what it is, instead of calling it junk or, whatever, to call it by its name. Mm-hmm. That can be quite helpful. I also think having, helping that child develop a good relationship with their body, and just also check in with yourself and just your own fears often that comes from a place where you've been perhaps experienced bullying or negative messaging around your body, and that showing up with your own child when you see them sort of copying behavior that you might find triggering. So it's always helpful to take a moment to pause, check in with yourself, what's going on for you. I think speaking to kids in the moment can be quite tricky. Rather choose the timing of the conversation a little bit more, and really try and distinguish between what you're noticing. If you are noticing a child is eating, let's say, emotionally, or is eating beyond a point where you feel that is satisfying their needs, even though, as we said, they do have an increased need. Trying to understand if they perhaps were under eating previously throughout the day. Did they actually get in enough? And this, what you are seeing, is actually just natural compensatory behavior because they haven't had enough access to food throughout the day. I would also say, is there a sensory need? Are they feeling dysregulated, overwhelmed from the day? Are they quite stressed? So instead of coming in with, what are you eating and how much are you eating, rather to ask them if they're okay. What's going on for them that day? Is there something they want to talk about? That can often go a much longer way than trying to micromanage portion sizes and every bite.
Yeah.
So it's zooming out in a way and looking at your child from a bigger picture and saying what else is going on in this child's life.
Yeah.
And also having open conversations. I would also say, really helpful with all areas of parenting a teen is coming in with a bit more curiosity and a bit less judgment. I know it's really easy to say and much harder to do, but really like asking, finding out, learning more than just coming in with sort of shaming statements, which I know is always from a well-intended place, but can come across quite hurtful and can be quite seen as quite harmful. And as always, if you are at a loss or if you are feeling stuck or you're not sure, there is to get professional support and rather do it earlier than later. Have their growth monitored or assessed by their general practitioner, or speak to a dietitian or someone that can help guide you in this process. Because as I said, it can be quite individual. Some kids, there's lots going on. There's executive functioning challenges. There is sensory processing differences, and that can show up in their eating. So yeah, I think it is just to stay calm.
Yeah.
Watch your language, and see if you can support your child perhaps more holistically.
Yeah. Great advice. And there's so much there that I want to get into. You talked about body shaming, about our parental issues kind of affecting our children and our response to our children. I certainly see that a lot when children who are going through puberty who suddenly put on weight, and the mums are a little bit worried that they've suddenly put on weight without understanding the physiology behind that. So I'd love to get into that more maybe when we talk about eating disorders. But just talking about understanding the nutritional needs of children in this stage, because you talked about they do need more, but what does that look like? Because I think for parents, it's difficult to know, okay, well, should they be eating as much as an adult? Should they be staying on what they were eating as a child? Where does that more calorie intake come from?
Depending on the activity level can play a role, but they would probably need probably slightly more than an adult.
Right.
I would probably say in a way to get that is to focus on those regular meals. On TV, I was watching all these kids, and now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. All these teenagers on the TV shows come down from, they're late, and then the mom's like, oh, you need to eat breakfast, and I can't, and then just walk out the door. And I don't know if that's just made us become that this is the norm. It's not. A child should be eating breakfast. And yes, you can definitely kind of work with your child and making sure that they can get something that that matches their appetite or time-saving options and stuff, but it has to start with breakfast, regular meals throughout the day, probably around every 3 to 4 hours. But some kids, especially if they've got high needs, like they're athletic, they might need every 2 hours, depending. Some kids, just also from timing and stuff. So I think regular meals is a good place to start.
Okay.
Eating of all the food groups, not cutting out any specific ones.
Yeah.
And also allowing your child to eat according to how full they are, how if they want seconds or thirds to support that.
Okay.
And then, there are definitely some micronutrients and things that sort of become different. So I don't know, Vanessa, like, just correct me if I'm wrong, but there is like, your iron requirements and stuff go up more exponentially than, let's say, for example, what we see in adults.
Absolutely. I did want to get into that, Vanessa. So what types of nutritional deficiencies do you see as being so common in the adolescents?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most common ones is iron.
Yes.
Particularly amongst girls, and particularly once they start their periods.
Yeah.
And their iron requirements are double what an adult male would be,
right,
as a teenage girl particularly.
Wow.
So, and I think it's often a nutrient that's forgotten,
yes,
that needs to be replaced. And, from a baby, I think when they're babies, we're really focused on that. When we first start solids, it's really important, but that kind of drops off as the years go by. Because also I think amongst teens, it can be very fashionable to, go on a vegetarian diet or to go on a vegan diet. Yeah. And to cut out certain food groups. And particularly if their friends are starting to cut out certain food groups, they may follow. And also, I guess, children are growing up much more socially and environmentally aware. And so, they may be looking at sustainable eating practices and things like that. And so often many of the well-known iron sources might drop off, and many children are forgetting to replace those. So they might be cutting out meat. And it's totally, it's easy to be getting enough iron without meat, but you need to be really conscientious about it. It's not just cutting the meat out and eating vegetables, which is very common practice, I think, amongst teens. So iron is a really important one. I think calcium as well. The teenage years are really formative years for setting down the foundations of our bone. And we forget that it's actually probably the most crucial period of our life for getting enough calcium in our diet.
Certainly is,
yeah. And it's really hard if you are not eating dairy, it is more difficult. And again, you need to be a lot more conscientious to do that. But I think it's definitely a nutrient that the awareness of it just drops off in the teenage years, whereas the requirements increase quite exponentially.
Yeah. And as a parent, I mean, you want to kind of support your child's autonomy. You want them to develop that sense of self where they're deciding, actually, I don't want to eat animals anymore for ethical reasons. Actually, I don't agree with the dairy industry. You want to encourage that. But at the same time, you're saying, actually, iron deficiency is incredibly common. Calcium deficiency could be very detrimental. And we want to make sure that we're protecting their bones and making sure they get enough iron. So where do we as parents draw that line between advocating for their health, but trying to encourage them to be the person that they want to become?
Yeah, I think feeding children, it is often about empowerment. And we do want to empower our children with knowledge, and we want to empower them with a voice and make them feel heard. So I agree with you that we do want to be encouraging kind of strong opinions that they might be developing, but I think empower them to do it the right way. So if they want to be on a vegetarian diet, then, you can research together with your child about, okay, we can do this. We just need to make sure we're finding appropriate alternatives to meat. So we can be focusing on getting enough lentils and chickpeas and beans and nuts and seeds and green leafy vegetables and things like that as a great replacement. Accompany them with sources of vitamin C so that we can enhance the absorption of the iron. So it's trying to get the child involved. They're obviously interested enough in the topic if they want to be, improving the environment or increasing sustainability, which is great. So I think take it to that next level, to the nutrition side as well. And same with calcium. I think it's just empowering them with, let's find out together what are the best sources of calcium. And, when I see my clients, I would never just tell them the foods they should be eating or handing a list. It's about sitting down and brainstorming with them, kind of empowering them with, okay, these are the sources of calcium. How can we get some more in your diet, and working on that together.
And what are good non-dairy sources of calcium?
Well, I guess there's always the plant-based milks that are fortified with calcium. There are even orange juices that are fortified with calcium, if that's appropriate for that child. There are things like tofu, calcium set tofu, nuts like almonds are, quite a good source of calcium, and things like canned fish with edible bones. So canned salmon, canned sardines that have the edible bone are a great source as well.
Now, if you have a child who is very aware of the environment, does want to give up meat, does want to give up dairy, but they are quite picky. You know, a lot of the things that you've mentioned, lentils, chickpeas, you know, a lot of teens might struggle to eat that to a level that they would get the nutrients they need from that. What do we do then? Because then you're that parent who is saying, I support you to be who you want to be, but nagging and nagging, you must eat this, you must eat that, you must eat this. Come on, you've got to eat it. Do we just take the view, okay, I'm not going to nag because that's going to have negative effects. I'm just going to supplement.
It's a very difficult line as a parent. It's a fine line. I think you're right. And I think, you know, this is where we can work together. And again, you know, reaching out for professional support in this situation, I think is a great idea. Just reaching for supplements, I think, is not always the solution because we forget that when we are getting, you know, something like milk, for example, it's not just the calcium we're getting from that. We're also getting the protein. We're getting vitamin B12. You know, there are many foods like chickpeas and lentils where we're getting the fiber, you know, as well. So I think ideally, we as dietitians, we always like to go food first, right? There's definitely a place for supplements, but I wouldn't ever really want to just start on the supplements. I think getting something like some baseline blood tests done, if that's an option, is always a good idea, and working from there. We don't want to be supplementing with iron, for example, unless they come up with low iron levels. So I think it's working through some of those clinical parameters, I suppose. And then working it through together with your child and, you know, working out, I guess we don't want to be a nag. That's
Absolutely,
true.
we don't.
We want to empower them a little bit, but we do also want them to be growing and thriving and to be in their best place nutritionally and developing well. And I think that we have to find the balance between the two.
And we touched on picky eating. And I think for me, certainly that's something that I always thought of as being, you know, for younger children, the toddlers refusing to eat. And certainly I think there's lots of information about how to tackle that at that age. But is that something you see? So if a child has been picky when they're younger, is that something you see that kind of carries on into teenage years?
It can. It definitely can. Especially if the pickiness comes from a sensory sensitivity, then that could very well stay with the child.
And how would you know it's a sensory issue?
I think a lot of picky eating comes from a sensory place. But there's you can also, again, look at your child from a bigger point of view and zoom out and look at the different, you know, there are sensory questionnaires and stuff around, but just looking at your child's sensory profile and temperament and, you know, other things that's going on in their life. Are they sensitive to, you know, the labels of their clothing, to certain fabrics, you know, how do they experience those types of things, loud noises, things like that. But if it is a more oral sensitivity with the texture and the taste, that can change, but it often can stay. Then also, you know, gastrointestinal discomfort can sometimes make a child not have an appetite or don't feel like eating. And if that is going undiagnosed and unrecognized throughout their life, then that will stay. And then I suppose some children, you know, some people just don't have a very sophisticated wide palate and they have a little bit more limited range. And that's why with picky eating, you get so many different, you know, we call it picky eating, but it can actually be a lot of different things. And something like the avoidant restricted food intake disorder, which is ARFID, which generally a child will not grow out of. And then you would need quite specific strategies to support that child's nutrition intake. I think we both have kids that, you know, were very adventurous eaters as infants and as toddlers. And now, I don't know, with the tween years, there's a lot of food preferences coming through that wasn't there. And I see that also as a part of development and experimenting with what I like and I don't like. And we work around that and we try and honor that. I always come back to sort of non-negotiables with kids and with, like, especially even with the vegetarian is I'll support you in this and I'll, you know, but you've got to eat. And it's not just about what you're not eating, it's things that we can add in. So what can we find that works well for you within what you like and dislike? So approaches with picky eating in teens is a little bit different.
Yeah.
I think you'd need a lot more buy-in, agency. There is more, it's definitely more a self-led journey for that child or that teen. We speak a lot about sort of foods that they are interested in exploring a bit more of, and often it's not nutritionally the ones that we would want, but it's socially the ones. And then that's where we start.
Okay. Great advice. And we talked there about, it being very difficult for some teens to kind of explore beyond what they're used to. I think for some parents, it can be very, very difficult to go beyond that kind of broccoli, carrots, peas on rotation. But at the same time, we know that getting plant diversity in their diets is really important. Any tips for parents on how we can achieve that?
I mean, yes, I'm a parent and I've been through it all too. I would try not to get too bogged down by one thing.
Okay.
And I think when we look at plant diversity, it's not just vegetables.
Yeah.
And it's not just fruit. It can be including a variety of nuts and seeds. It could be including some beans or, I agree mine wouldn't eat lentils and chickpeas either, but they'll eat hummus, or they'll have a smoothie where I can throw in lots of different nuts and seeds and throw in some different fruits and, throw in some nut butter and things like that. So I think you don't need to be getting too fixated. And I think, as we know as parents, children do go through phases. And we need to be helping them through that phase. Mm-hmm. But also, like Carleen said, we have some non-negotiables and, the different vegetables are on the table. They don't need to be eating them, but they're continuing to be exposed to them. They're continuing to have them on their plate and be in a non-pressured environment and hopefully given the freedom to explore them at their own pace.
Do you advocate for all the family just eating one meal? So if parents are eating a salad and, things like lentils and chickpeas and things like that, do you advocate for just putting that on the table and everyone eats that? And if you don't like it, eventually you'll try it.
Yeah, I think food should be provided with respect and compassion to people's preferences. So I love family style meals that have different components to them. And I think there does need to be something for everyone on that table. We need a child to be able to want to come to the table and feel comfortable and know that there's going to be something there that's going to nourish them. But we also want them to be exposed to foods that they are still learning to like.
Yeah.
So having a variety of foods on the table is really helpful. And we sometimes just have different versions of, we may have a spicier version for the parents and, a toned down for the children. We may have a few different vegetables because we know that at least there's something for everyone there. Yeah.
And we talked before about nutritional needs and the idea that children may actually need to eat kind of every 3 hours, maybe even 2 if they're an athlete. Can we talk about that? Because certainly in Singapore, a lot of children are doing a lot of sport. What types of things should we be thinking about as parents for our teen athletes?
Well, first of all, the basics stay the same, right? There's not a teen athlete and a teen is, we want to, so food foundation basics stay the same. Yeah. Where the athlete is slightly different is they need just even more of everything. But what becomes tricky is the timing. So they have busy schedules. They're often running from one training to another. And as we said here in Singapore, especially, they are often doing it independently through public transport or getting a Grab. And then the parents are not there to be able to provide a lunchbox or a snack box. Also, in this heat, you can't be packing something in the morning and expecting them to be eating that at 4:00. So it makes it extra tricky. And so what I often suggest to parents to do is to take their child's schedule, sit with them, not only look at their daily schedule, but also their week, and see sort of where things trip up a bit. So like a lot of my athletes would be like, let's say Thursday afternoon, they've got a double session and then a Friday morning early session and Saturday a tournament. So that's quite a lot of training, bulking up and putting together. And then you would need to put in more strategic strategies for those days to make sure that the child's supported in their needs. So with athletes, paying attention to what they eat before, sometimes during and after training, and really helping that child be able to meet that. So early morning swim, don't have an appetite, I'm just going to go swimming. It's not okay. It doesn't, it really doesn't help that athlete to train on an empty stomach. And so working with your child or with a dietitian to come up with something that child can eat before training that is satisfying. Also working with perhaps the coach in what to have before they go into school. The other day, I had to speak to a teacher just to allow, because the school rules said no eating, and we had to sort of advocate for the child to actually have a snack so that they had breakfast, after. So it's a lot of little things, practically walking that road with your child. What does the vending machine in the 7-Eleven look like when they walk out of their football training? What are the options there? And can you support them with perhaps packing some things like a granola bar or some nuts, and then they get something from the shop to kind of complement that. And it's just supporting your child with getting the options, because often they'll just be like, oh, I didn't know. There wasn't anything.
Yeah. And there are lots of kind of sports targeted products. So, energy bars and sports drinks. And it's difficult to know whether those are just marketing. Do our children actually need it, or should they be getting those extra calories from actual food? And obviously that is difficult. As you said, packing food in the morning for something that's going to be eaten at 4 or 5 o'clock is tricky. So what's your advice for parents there? Are these energy drinks okay? Or should they be avoided? What should we be doing?
So in terms of, we always want to try and meet the bulk of their nutrition through diet and basic food principles, or, basic foods. So that would perhaps be looking at what is available at the school cafeteria, helping with menu choices and stuff. So definitely bulk of the diet should be coming from food. But these sort of sports foods can definitely play a role for when that isn't practical.
Okay.
And if you think about a pyramid, at the bottom it would be food, and at the top it would be these sport foods, which is sometimes the opposite way some kids see it. But so it can often fill gaps or supplement a meal that, they ran out of time to have. And they definitely work well around, being able to provide that fast releasing carbohydrates that is needed around training in sort of in a practical way, because most, coaches is not going to allow you to go eat a sandwich halfway through training and then you would need a sports drink. You could make a sports drink at home, and a home-based one. You don't have to buy it.
What would you put in it?
I would probably use a combination of fruit juice, water. I would add a bit of sugar to get the fructose-glucose ratio right. I'd probably add a bit of salt just for taste. You could also use different things and stuff that your kid likes. So you could make things from scratch, but not every parent or household has the capacity to do that.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of options available that are, if you read the ingredients list, reads like the recipe that you would make at home, like granola bars and stuff. You'd be like, oh, that's actually sort of how I would make it. Yeah. So those foods make a good option. But I think in terms of sport-specific supplements, like performance-enhancing supplements, the general guide is not for under 18s.
Okay.
There are always exceptions, but I would always do that under the supervision of a dietitian or a sports physician, because there's always risks involved. There's dosages that needs to be considered, and also with the risk of banned substances and supplementation, it's very important if your child is competing and being tested, you have to be very specific that your supplements are safe.
And when you talk about sports-specific supplements, you're talking about creatine, protein, that type of thing. Because I do see a lot of, teenage boys who might not be, athletes doing lots, but actually they've bought into this idea that they've got to be lean and they want to put on muscle. Maybe they are, rugby players who want to get bigger. And a lot of them are kind of mainlining protein shakes. There's lots of it in the media about protein and the emphasis on protein. What's your view on that for additional protein in children? Because I am sure this is a minefield. It is in adults. But what about for teens?
So generally, we go back to what are their goals. And if it is to increase muscle mass, they need an increase in calories. And this is often where the misconception comes. So I sit a lot with these boys and we work through sort of their just basic nutrition education. So the increase in calories, how they need both carbohydrates and protein and a bit of fat to actually get that anabolic effect. We work a lot around the timing of the meals. Often it's not so much about the quantity of protein, but the timing of protein,
Right.
And getting that right. And generally with most of these kids, there's a bunch of stuff that we need to address before we actually get to the supplementation. And the supplementation will always have such a small effect. So if the basics isn't right, then you don't get that performance benefit. So we start with getting the basics right, getting the timing and the quantities. And if, let's say, there's practically, or, some of these kids do have a lot of training, especially like sports like water polo and swimming, and they've got morning, evening training sessions, then and you want to look at supplementation, you would always look at sort of food first. There's some sort of food-based ways of adding in more protein, like, for example, milk powder can often be added to foods, and a bunch of other products and things that you could use. And you would use more food-based stuff.
Right.
And if you then get to a situation where there is a lot of indicators for more sport-specific ones, it's again back to dosage, safety, making sure it's the right ones, and also understanding the maturity level of that child. We know a lot of these from research that these performance-enhancing supplements can act as a gateway into anabolic steroid use later on. So it gives the kids this false sense of performance enhancements, like I need this to be able to perform. And so we have to be very careful in our messaging and how we place these products. And again, it's not just the banned substances, because I used to see kids that are really only for aesthetic reasons looking into these supplements. It is the other products that they add to the supplements. So some of these products can cause liver problems, or it's unsafe, or it hasn't been tested in children, never mind still going through puberty and growing. Well, I mean, the evidence is lacking in the adults with safety and risk, and then
let alone children.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Especially going through all of these like changes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's quite a few cases. I normally share just a bit about some of the like cases we found from liver toxicity and stuff with some of these supplements.
Wow.
It's not well known in the public, but it is. There's a lot of documentation on it.
Yeah, there was a review I saw recently on it. And what about girls, female teen athletes? Because one of the things I see in adults is that if women are running marathons, doing a marathon kind of every other day, they will often come in saying, "Oh, my period's gone. What's going on?" And that's a condition called hypothalamic amenorrhea. And that's because exercise can lead to a reduction in the hormone in the brain, as you know, which controls ovulation and the production of estrogen. So obviously, as we spoke about, bone health in teenage girls is incredibly important, and that's driven by estrogen. And so, we don't want them to lose their period. But at the same time, they're going for a goal. They may need to exercise that much. How do we kind of mitigate the risks without taking away their training?
Yeah, I think it can happen definitely from overtraining, and one has to look at their training, and are they perhaps putting in too much and they're not training smart in smart ways, and is there enough rest and recovery for the body? But obviously nutrition plays a big role, and something we call relative energy deficiency in sport, or underfueling, however you want to name it, means that the child is not getting in enough nutrients to support that training. So it is quite common, especially in athletes. And also depending on the different sports, you also get ranging sort of, I think it's quite more common like in gymnastics and swimming, but even football and stuff, it is quite common.
Yeah.
The thing that probably makes me sad or worried is that a lot of coaches actually think it's normal.
Yes.
A lot of teen athletes think it's normal.
Yeah.
It's not. It shouldn't be happening, and it should be addressed.
Yeah.
But equally, I mean, some people will be underfueled and not skip their period. So it's not always an indicator that everything's going well, but it definitely does give us information. So there you would assess the risk of the child, and there are protocols in place, like return to play protocols that you would look at, that has been developed by the International Olympic Committee on how to sort of manage these athletes, to see sort of how we can increase their energy intake while keeping them safe. Perhaps looking at some competitions, and training, what is absolutely necessary, what can we adjust to get them into that better, healthy place.
Yes.
Because ultimately, if you are missing your period and you're underfueling, you are also probably not performing at your best.
Quite
So
right, yeah.
it's a lot. It's always about, it's very much linked to performance.
Absolutely.
So you will obviously be doing better if you eat better.
Yeah. I mean, I find that some girls you speak to about this are reticent to add in extra calories, perhaps because they have kind of absorbed this idea that either it's normal, it's fine, they're supposed to lose their period if they're training hard, it's a sign I'm doing well, but also because they don't really want to put on weight. And I think you're right that, it comes from some particular sports like gymnastics. I suppose that leads into talking about body image and eating disorders, which I like to touch on with you both. So what types of things do you see children coming in with when they're coming in with an eating disorder? What types of things are they saying about their triggers and what's kind of led to them using food as that control or coping mechanism?
It can be so multifaceted. And I think a lot of the time when we're seeing them, they may not yet be accepting that there is an issue. And I think we, and Carleen and I, play our role in our eating disorder interest group, just trying to help professionals understand not even red flags, but just warning signs that, things are not so right.
And what are they? So if I'm a mum and I've got a teen girl who's kind of suddenly saying, oh, actually, I just want to be healthier, mum. I want to be healthier. Actually, I'm going to have the salad. Or just, tweaking their food choices a little bit. And actually, sometimes you might be quite pleased about that if that's a child that hasn't had a good diet. But is that a warning sign? Should I be worried about that?
There's nothing wrong with tweaking, so that it still remains balanced, I think. And I think, there's nothing wrong with being aware of the food that they're eating. But when it starts to become all consuming, when they're dropping food groups for a start, when they're constantly kind of looking at themselves in the mirror, or they're constantly commenting on their appearance, or obviously clinical signs like weight loss, particularly rapid weight loss. And there are parameters that we look at that help to determine whether there is a diagnosis of an eating disorder, but often a preoccupation with food. And, many that I see might be bakers, and they might cook for everybody else, but don't eat the food that they're preparing themselves. They won't let anybody else prepare their food for them because they feel like they need to control everything that they're consuming. And when meals are being skipped and food groups are being skipped, I think, I guess there are also physical signs. There can be things like hair loss, and skin changes, feeling the cold more extremely, and a lack of energy, but also gastrointestinal changes might occur as well. So often constipation and bloating are a common response to restriction.
Okay. And if we're thinking about the child who hasn't lost weight, she doesn't have any of those physical signs, perhaps she is displaying some of the early warning signs, and a parent kind of wants to nip it in the bud. But they're worried that they don't want to start making an issue about food, but at the same time they've noticed some worrying signs. They can see an obsession forming. What can they do? How do they actually approach meals? So if you've got a child who's saying, oh, actually, mum, I don't want to eat that. They've always eaten it. It's not something that they have ever refused before, but actually, mummy, I don't want to eat that, or I'm only eating half my meal. And you see that and you think, that's not quite right for my daughter. I know my daughter quite well, or my son. How do we approach that? Are we supposed to be saying, no, you need to sit and eat everything on your plate? Because that can lead to problems as well. So how do we approach that?
Yeah, I think there are certain boundaries and non-negotiables that we can have as parents. We can still expect our children to be coming to the table and eating with the family. Yeah, I think it's fair enough to set boundaries like that. It's still important to be having breakfast before they walk out the door, have a snack before they're heading to their exercise. And I think we do need to be careful to be approaching it neutrally, and to be including the child. Our tastes change, and sometimes we have to go with the phases, but with support and encouragement and guidance, I think. And I really would reiterate that if it is if there are early signs, and I guess it's not about weight loss necessarily.
Absolutely.
Many eating disorders have nothing to do with weight itself. It's about the relationship with food and the eating patterns. So weight is not always the best clinical sign to be looking out for. But I would be reaching out for support, either to your GP or to a dietitian or to a psychologist if you feel like, and there's often obviously many things going on. It's not always just the food, but the food becomes an avenue that the teen can perhaps gain some control.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're noticing those early warning signs, perhaps rather than kind of badgering them to eat more, finish everything on your plate, maybe that's a sign that they need more help.
Yes, and I think try to have open conversations if you can, give them opportunities to talk. They may completely retreat, and that's often a real sign that teens often retreat anyway, right?
Yeah.
But they may be refusing to eat with the rest of the family and will only eat in their bedroom. And I think, that's a sign, and that's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And you mentioned the team. So when we are looking after people with eating disorders, it's, usually a general practitioner, a psychiatrist if need be, a psychologist and a dietitian. Can you explain to everyone what your role is in that?
Yeah, I like to work very closely with the doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists. Yeah. We work really closely so that we're all coming from the same page, and it's definitely a multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah.
As a dietitian, I like to focus on, their relationship with food. Obviously, we need to look at nutrition, making sure that they're meeting all of their requirements, and it depends what stage of recovery or their eating disorder journey that they're at. And obviously if they're at an acute stage, the priority really is getting the food in. And at that stage, their brains are undernourished and they're not working properly. So we need to step in, and we need to have a team, and we need to be providing the parents with support and saying, this is the food that you need to be providing. This is what needs to be eaten, however that may be.
And at that stage, is it okay to have a battle over that food? Because we've diagnosed that she's got an eating disorder. Perhaps she or he is in denial about that, or not ready to accept that they do need to start eating more. Is it okay then to start having a battle about eating?
Well, I would never say it's okay to have a battle over food, but the priority is to be renourishing, and to be renourishing the brain. So we do need to work on getting that in however we can. And, again, I like to work with the patient through this as well. And there may be a lot of resistance, and it may not be the most nutritious food in the world, but trying to get food in, get it more often, and schedule and structure, I think is ultimately the most important thing at that stage, is just getting 3 meals and 2 or 3 snacks in every day is probably the most important thing.
Yeah. How often do you find that your patients kind of recover and they don't relapse? Or do you find that actually you're seeing them again and again and again, they get better, and actually then they're coming back to you?
I think we know, there's a lot of research to say that early intervention is super, super effective. So those first couple of years, it's really important to try and get in and get as much support to the child and their family as possible. And we know that the outcomes are going to be much, much better. The longer it's left, the longer it's ignored, it gets really hard to change some of those practices. So if we can get in early, that's going to help to see them continually coming back. What I do find, particularly with teenagers, is they may be doing really well, and then they have a really stressful period in their life, like exams, for example. And sometimes that can be a real setback for them. So it's important that they're getting continual support. It's those kind of situations can be really triggering. And puberty in general and any kind of hormone changes are going to be making quite a big difference as well. And sometimes that can lead to relapse as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, it's not always about body image, but sometimes it is. How can we as parents kind of promote a healthy body image in our children? And do you see that as parents, we have a big role in that?
I do think we have a very big role. Yes, I think we can definitely role model in that we don't need to be talking about our bodies in front of our children. We need to be the way we can talk about our bodies is how amazing they are and all of the functions that they help us to be active, and everything that we can do with our bodies. I think it's a really good focus. That body appreciation and gratitude is a really good thing for us to do. So we can talk about our bodies, but just in a really positive way.
And in the same way that you want us to talk about food, right? In a positive way or a neutral way. A neutral way. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. That was such a good discussion. Can we do some myth busting? Yes. Okay. So got some myth busters for you. Okay. Organic food. Now, obviously this has a financial component to it, but if you can afford organic food, is it actually better for your children, or is it a marketing ploy?
There's something to be said, I guess, for the environment and sustainable farming practices and things like that by going organic. Nutritionally, organic food is no more nutritious necessarily than non-organic food. And so my focus tends to be on however you can get an abundance of fruit and vegetables in your diet, then that's great. You know, if you are able to do that with organic foods, fantastic. That's ticking a lot of boxes. Sometimes there's a taste factor as well, that it may be more tasty. But if it's going to limit your availability, and if you just don't have access, or it just means that you're only going to have a narrow number of fruit and vegetables that you eat because they're the only ones that you can find organically, I would much prefer diversity and abundance over organic.
Okay. Thank you. Right. Gut microbiome testing in children. Microbiome is huge. It's everywhere. But do we have evidence of using it in children?
Short answer, no, I don't think so. I'd probably, so definitely not as a first line, potentially not even second line. With the kids I see with gastrointestinal problems, there's often quite a few things that we can do in the meantime or instead that has a lot more evidence to support gut health for the kids than doing a very expensive gut microbiome test, which again, you get better ones and sort of not great ones. And I just don't, although it's being used in research quite a lot, I don't think we have the sort of clinical guidelines to determine what we do with that report with kids.
Absolutely.
It's also just a snapshot, right? I have clients come up with gut microbiomes from last year, and I'm like, well, you know, things have changed.
That was last year. Yeah.
It's like bloods. We kind of, and do we keep doing them? And so it gets quite complex. And like I said, a lot of the families I work with, they have multiple things going on. There's OTs, there's this, there's that. And I feel we can use that money a lot more effectively with a lot more evidence-based strategies. But yeah, it's interesting to see and maybe
see where it goes. Yeah. But your view at the moment is that not quite ready to be used.
Definitely not as first line, no.
As first line. Okay. Leading on from that then, probiotics in children. Should we not?
I think it's very strain specific and sort of disease or symptom specific. The evidence that we have is very much this strain for this condition. So if you are thinking of using a probiotic, it would be very useful to get the right strain or right combination of strains for that condition. It also just doesn't seem to work for everyone. So you could always trial it for a month or 3 and see if it makes a difference. If it doesn't, the guidelines actually say to stop. Using sort of willy-nilly probiotics for different things I don't think is effective, but it does have some use in specific conditions. Yeah.
Okay, specific conditions. You're not saying actually every child should just be taking a probiotic? No,
because the benefits, again, the cost to benefit ratio there, I don't think is there. Like, for example, if they're on antibiotics, definitely, if there is a specific condition. But even, I mean, the types of probiotics that you get, the cold chain supply, and in Singapore when things are imported, I think it's something to consider. So even the research sometimes is done on specific products. So it gets a bit tricky, but we definitely use it at times, and it can be quite helpful, definitely. But again, it depends a lot, and I would probably see it more as something that you want to discuss with your dietitian and sort of get the right strain for the right condition.
Yeah. And we touched on this earlier, but multivitamins for every child, just as a blanket use.
Similar to the probiotics, I think there's no need, just blanket. If you're concerned, there's no harm. The problem with a lot of multivitamins is that they've got very low levels of each nutrient. They've got, 30 vitamins, all at a very low dose. So I think if there is a need for a specific nutrient, we're much better to go for individual nutrient supplements.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like iron is often not in a multivitamin or so
like
low.
5 milligrams.
So
tiny.
you like, you'd rather target the ones that are needed.
And calcium's never in a supplement, in a multivitamin.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, good advice. Right, food allergy testing. So I often get patients that will come in, or parents come in, worried that their child might have a food intolerance. And we talk about food allergy testing versus elimination diets. What's your view on that? I know what my view is, but what's your view on that?
I mean, there's food allergies are very different to food intolerances.
Absolutely.
Food allergies are an overreaction of our immune system to a particular protein. And so there's a lot of evidence base for testing for those. We have skin prick tests and we have blood tests as well that are going to pick up the allergy. A food intolerance is very different, and it's much harder to detect. It might be a carbohydrate molecule that they might be intolerant to. And unfortunately, there's no evidence-based test available, really. There are plenty of tests out there.
There's the IgG testing, which lots of functional
testing
practitioners will do. What's your view on that?
I think they're not always very useful, and they may actually just be flagging foods that the child has been exposed to. Yeah. So I often find we get these reams of results brought into us, and we'll have a look at it, and everybody does tend to come back with relatively similar.
The same thing.
And, or we might see the child on the other end of that they've had this test, they've actually cut out a lot of foods because of the testing, and we might see them because they've lost weight and they're malnourished as a result of that. So we have to be really careful the way we interpret those results. And actually the gold standard of detecting a food intolerance is by elimination, elimination.
Quickly explain how we do an elimination diet. How would you do that? So if you're worried that your child has an intolerance to tomatoes, what would you do?
Well, I would never really do this alone. I would always do it with some medical or professional guidance if possible. And I would, there are big elimination diets where you might eliminate all the foods that are potential problems. For children, that's just really inappropriate because they're often very limited and it's going to be really restrictive, particularly with nutrients for them and variety. So I would prefer to have a bit more of a top-down approach and perhaps have a look, maybe get them to keep a food and symptom diary for a while just to see if there's any kind of flags, talk it through in detail. And if something stands out, we might look at that first and say, well, let's cut out the tomatoes and see what happens. But I would always want to do a controlled reintroduction as well, just
so
to
challenge
challenge
that bit, isn't it?
Yes,
okay.
It's easy to eliminate when we think it's the problem, but it could be so many others at the same time.
And also when you're eliminating, to make sure that the nutrition requirements are still met. So if you are taking dairy out, that calories, the protein, the calcium is coming in from a different source.
Yes.
And not so that child doesn't go into a calorie restrictive diet.
Okay. And last one, because I think this causes a bit of confusion. What is the difference between a dietitian, you're both dietitians, and a nutritionist? What's the difference? Is there any difference? If so, what is the difference?
Well, you can be both a nutritionist and a dietitian, and we would both consider ourselves dietitians and nutritionists.
Got it. Okay.
And I guess being able to call yourself a dietitian in many countries, it's protected, and you need to be registered and be able to uphold certain level of professional development to be able to maintain that title of a registered dietitian. I think many people can call themselves a nutritionist. It's not as regulated, and it may be a short course in nutrition that gives them the title of nutritionist. So it's just sometimes it's a level of training.
Yes. So when you say you call yourself a dietitian and a nutritionist, do you mean that you're coming at it from both an illness perspective and a wellness perspective, that you can do the range of
That's
issues?
exactly right. Yes. And I would look at, say, a dietitian is more able to look clinically and look at, acute and chronic conditions and treat those. Whereas I guess, and look at more at the individual patient. And I think a nutritionist may not be as trained clinically to be able to look into that level of
to see
detail.
the whole picture. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you both so much. Can I ask you one last question? We have a TWH book club. Do you have a book that is either changed your practice, changed your life in some way that you want to recommend to our listeners?
It's like choosing your favorite child. I read a lot. So if I had to choose one, probably I really like How to Raise an Intuitive Eater.
Oh, nice. Who's that by?
Sumner Brooks.
Okay.
And I think, and Amy Stevenson. Might need to double check that. I think, it's a great book. It kind of covers a lot.
Awesome. Thank you. Vanessa, have you got one?
I guess one that I read a long time ago, but was Feeding Families by Jill Castle. And I just think it's got really good information across the nutrition side, but also raising happy eaters and helping them to develop a positive relationship with food. But there are so many.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those sounds like two good ones. So we'll put those in the book club. Thank you so much for coming. It was such a great discussion. I'm sure parents will find that very useful. So thank you very much.
Thank
you. All right. And that's it from us. I've been Dr. Natalie Hutchins for the Women's Handbook Podcast.
The content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to replace the doctor-patient relationship, nor does it constitute personalised medical advice. If you are affected by any of the topics discussed, please speak to your doctor or a qualified healthcare professional.